This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. Right now we're in between limited formats. We've got Wilds of Eldraine, but I've talked about that format a ton, and we don't quite have any information about Lost Caverns of Ixalan to talk about. So as usual in this inter format period, I like to talk about more evergreen topics that are always useful and about limited in general instead of about a particular format. And that's what we're doing today when I'm going to be talking about 5 effects that are good in constructed but bad in limited. I think this is a useful topic because these are also effects, at least 4 of them anyway, are often overrated in limited, especially by people who play a lot more constructed than they do limited. For example, there are a lot of people who only play limited like at the pre-releases or whatever, and they might see a card with one of these effects and be like, well, this is amazing in constructed, so surely it's good in limited, where card power level's even lower. But it turns out these effects, for a variety of reasons, aren't as good in limited, despite being relatively powerful in constructed. And in this video, I'm going to explain why that is, in addition to pointing out these kinds of effects. So let's start with one of the effects that's one of the most powerful in Magic, but really is a huge dud in limited, and that is a ritual effect. Rituals like Dark Ritual give you a temporary mana boost. You spend a card and you get mana for it, and that's what you get. These kinds of cards are incredibly powerful. One of the famous, most powerful early plays in Magic during its early days was Dark Ritual into Hypnotic Spectre, right? You play this 3-mana 2/2 flyer on turn 1. Every time it hits your opponent, they have to discard a card at random. And, if your opponent doesn't deal with that quickly, they're going to have their hand ripped apart and be completely defenseless. So why is this kind of effect bad and limited? Well, because it's inherently card advantage. It's almost never a good idea in limited to spend a card on something that gives you a mana advantage temporarily, because first of all, you have to get it. If you're going to do the Dark Ritual Hypnotic Spectre thing, you've got to get both of those on turn 1, or it's not going to be nearly as powerful. So first of all, you have to have the timing line up perfectly, which is harder in limited. In constructed, you can have 4 rituals, 4 Hypnotic Spectres. Getting that in your opening hand is pretty reasonable expectation. In limited, you're going to have like one of each, for example, and you're just not going to be able to play your powerful 3-drop on turn 1 very often. So Dark Ritual effects get worse the later the game goes on, for one thing, and that is a factor, but the card disadvantage part is an even bigger problem. Say you do manage to pay 1 black on turn 1, so let's set up this perfect situation. You pay 1 black on turn 1, and you put your Hypnotic Spectre into play. So Hypnotic Spectre does have an advantage over most things you could play with Dark Ritual, because if it does hit your opponent, you're now even on cards because they discard a card at random. So, this is a pretty good scenario for using Dark Ritual, but there aren't that many other creatures that are like Hypnotic Spectre, for one thing. But even if you are playing the Spectre, let's say, how many 1-mana removal spells are there at common in most limited formats that can just kill a 2/2 these days? The answer is like 4, right? So the chances that your opponent just untaps, plays a land, and kills it are very high, and it's even higher if you didn't go first. And when that happens, you just got 2 for 1. And that's when you're playing like one of the best things you can play on turn 1 with Dark Ritual. Imagine just playing like a 3-mana 3/3 on turn 1. That is a complete dud. You're just not going to be able to do something powerful enough in limited, consistently enough, and then the card like this is just inherent card disadvantage. And we have evidence that this is the case. This is something that's been true in limited basically forever. I will note that we're not talking about cube here. Like rituals in, vintage cube are pretty good, but that's because there's a storm deck. You can cast a bunch of rituals and power things out and get a high storm count and kill your opponent. You can't do that in normal limited formats. And like I said, we do have evidence of this. Dark Ritual was in the Strixhaven Mystical Archive. So we have data from 17 lands that tells us, how good that actually was in the format. And the answer is that it was horrible. Its win rate was 44.2%. And that's even worse than it sounds, because the average win rate for Strixhaven on 17 lands is 55%. So this is an unplayable card in limited. Dark Ritual is. And this is like one of the most efficient ones. The 2-mana ones that make 3 mana, like that kind of thing, those are even worse, right? So Don't play ritual effects in limited unless we're talking, again, cube. That's a whole other animal. But, your typical limited format, a card that does nothing but produce mana at the cost of a card just isn't worth it. This is true of cards like Simian Spirit Guide, things like that too. Next, let's talk about burn. So when I say burn, I don't mean a card that can hit, a creature or an opponent. I'm not talking about removal. I'm not talking about red removal spells that have the upside of damaging the opponent. Obviously, that's good because it's a removal spell with upside. But cards that can only damage the opponent, and that's the whole effect, those are horrible in limited, even though they're pretty good in constructed. Like Lava Spike, for example, 1 red mana, do 3 to an opponent. That card's good. I mean, it sees play in Modern, right? Well, it does, but a 1 mana deal 3 to an opponent only in limited is actually kind of bad. I mean, if you can get a critical mass of them, things change a little bit because suddenly you have, these cards that can just do a bunch of damage, but it's hard to do that in limited. It's hard to get like 5 Lava Spike effects in your deck in limited. So what's the problem here? Well, it's similar to the problem with rituals in that it's basically card disadvantage. If you spend a card and its only purpose is to damage your opponent, you go down a card without affecting the board at all. And that's just not something you can do in limited. You need to be getting card advantage. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that wins you games in limited, right? Is card advantage. That's why card disadvantage is such a big problem. And a card like Lava Spike effectively does nothing until you reach a point where it can kill your opponent. And that situation just doesn't come up often enough for it to be worth playing in limited formats. The same is true of way worse effects too, like Lava Axe and the 5 mana deal 5. You don't really want to be playing those. This does not apply to cards that are like creatures that enter the battlefield and damage your opponent, or again to red removal that can hit the opponent. That's a whole other thing. Cards that do something and damage the opponent, you're not getting card disadvantage because, you're adding to the board and doing damage to your opponent. So it's a much different thing. I'm just talking about pure burn spells where the only mode the card has, the only thing the card does is damage the opponent. All right, next up, let's talk about fogs. Anytime I talk about how bad fogs are in limited, there's always blowback in the comments, and I'm sure I'm going to get it here because people have these anecdotal stories, these anecdotes, I guess is what that would be called, where it worked out for them, and it can, right? So a fog is a card that, one way or another, prevents all the damage your opponent's stuff does in a turn. Once again, what we're talking about here is card disadvantage. You're spending a card to not impact the board at all, and most of the time what you're doing when you fog is kind of delaying the inevitable, because if you have to play fog for it to matter, it probably means you were going to die. So you cast it, and great, you survive another turn, but that one turn, if you were going to die from their attack anyway, is very unlikely to matter. And yes, the scenario people always mention with fogs, and they do happen, right? I mean, these cards aren't always 100% of the time not going to do something, but they mostly don't do something, and that's what makes a card bad in limited, is how highly situational it is. The situation people always mention is, your opponent swings out and, they have lethal on board and you cast a fog and you happen to also be able to swing for lethal and you kill them on your turn, right? That happens. But that's basically the only situation where a fog is good, and that's like a very late game scenario that doesn't even come up in every game, doesn't even come up every time you draft. It comes up, maybe once every couple of times you draft where you and your opponent both have lethal on board and can just alpha strike for the win. It just doesn't happen very often. So most of the time a fog doesn't do something relevant. Preventing damage just isn't relevant enough, often enough. And in constructed, the reason fogs can sometimes be good, we have decks that show up in constructed every now and then called turbo fog decks. And these are usually like ramp control decks that can, with every turn they gain, do something way more powerful than they could. So they can run like a critical mass of fog effects and use those to make sure the game goes long enough for them to take over by ramping into something crazy, right? Like that's a whole other thing than what you can do in limited though. First of all, you're not going to be able to have a deck that's cohesive enough to be able to just like win the game because the game goes long. And second of all, you're not going to have enough fogs to really make a difference. And honestly, I think if you could, even if you had like 5 fogs in your deck in limited, I think you'd actually be in more trouble. Like this isn't like Lava Spike where I think if you have 5 of them, you're probably playing them because that's like a ton of damage that, makes a big difference. But with fogs, you're still talking about such a situational card that I don't think it would be very good. Fogs always have a horrible win rate in limited. There's one in Wilds of Eldraine, Eerie Interlude, which looks better than most fogs. Sorry, that's Eerie Interference. Eerie Interlude's a whole different card. So Eerie Interference is 2 generic and a white. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control this turn by creature. So this is better than most fogs. It does cost more than most. Like most fogs are like 1 or 2 mana, right? But this fog is one-sided, right? Surely that makes a difference because then it's not going to be card disadvantage as often because you can set up blocks that kill your opponent's stuff and things like that, right? Well, this one's been horrible too, unsurprisingly. I gave it a horrible grade in the set review, and it's panned out as an unplayable card. It has a win rate of 47.7% on 17 lands. It just doesn't happen often enough that you find a situation where Eerie Interference works. Can it work sometimes? Absolutely. But you're doing yourself more harm than good by running it in your deck. You'd much rather have a vanilla 3-mana 3/3 in your deck in this slot than you would this card, because a vanilla 3-mana 3/3 always adds to the board. It's always relevant. Eerie Interference, not so much. Next, I want to talk about lobotomy effects. These, I think of all of these, are probably the most obviously bad in Limited. These are cards that have you name a card, and then you search your opponent's library, hand, graveyard, etc., for all cards with that name and exile them. So there's a couple of problems here. Number one, we're once again talking about card disadvantage most of the time, unless you happen to name a card your opponent has in their hand, in which case you are at least getting a 1-for-1 trade, but you're not going to do it very often. So there are a few problems here for Limited. That first one, like I said, is card disadvantage. But then we also have another big problem, and that is you don't know what your opponent's deck has most of the time. Even if you're in game 2 and you've seen some of your opponent's deck, you're still not going to be able to name something often enough to actually hit it. And like I just said, you kind of have to be hitting a card in their hand too for it to even trade 1-for-1. Otherwise, you're going down a card for an effect that, guess what, doesn't impact the board at all. Another thing is multiples are going to be a lot less likely, further decreasing your chances of getting that 1-for-1 trade or hitting more than one card. Additionally, the reason these kinds of effects show up in constructed formats, and they do in all of them, like Necromentia, for example, is played in Modern and Legacy, is because there are lots of decks in constructed that are built around one really, really important card. And if you take that card away, that deck doesn't function. In Limited, that's not going to happen. Like, you don't have a combo deck most of the time. Again, we're not talking about Cube. You don't have a combo deck most of the time where your opponent can just name a card and you're like, well, there's no way for me to win the game now. That just doesn't happen. Your deck isn't going to be built that way. So between being card disadvantage, between making it being difficult to name the correct card, and the fact that you're just not going to get an effect out of this that matters or impacts the game, lobotomy effects like Necromentia and the like they're horrible cards in Limited. So let's wrap things up. Our final effect, another one that's really powerful, like on par with Rituals, really powerful and constructed, but absolutely terrible in Limited most of the time, are tutors. So a tutor is a card that lets you search your library for something and put it into your hand. These are not card disadvantage, unlike everything else we've talked about on this list. You generally go 1-for-1, right? Because you pay some amount of mana and get a card. So you're breaking even on cards. But the problem you're getting here is the extra mana you're paying. And that is a pretty big problem. We are talking about a card that on its own generally doesn't impact the board, which is true of these other 4 effects too. It's not card disadvantage, but it doesn't add to the board, and that's a problem. Another big problem is just that what makes tutors great in constructed is that you can search up really powerful cards. Like the power level of your deck is insane in constructed. In Vintage, you can use a tutor to search up Ancestral Recall or Time Walk, things like that. You generally don't have game-breaking cards like that in Limited. Tutors are also good in constructed if you have like a toolbox deck where you can search up a hate piece against a certain deck. Like, they're great cards in constructed. I mean, tutors of any, I guess, mechanic, if we want to call a tutor a mechanic, are probably the most banned and restricted mechanic of any in the entire game because they really create huge problems, especially in Legacy and Vintage. But again, not so much in Limited. We got a card in Wilds of Eldraine that looked like it might be a better than usual version of a tutor, and that is Beseech the Mirror. This one lets you pay 4 and search your library for anything, but if you bargain, if that thing is mana value 4 or less, you get to cast it for free. So I thought this tutor was going to be better than usual in Limited. I think I gave it a C or a C- in the set review, which obviously isn't a good grade, but most tutors just get Fs. I mean, a tutor effect is effectively, and not really that different from like Scry 1, draw a card. Obviously it is better than that because you get way better card selection than Scry 1, draw a card, but in terms of how it impacts your game, it's about the same as that. And if you're paying 4 mana for that, like with Beseech the Mirror, that's really bad. The reason I thought this one might pan out is because I thought if you bargained, you do have a tutor that adds to the board here, right? So you are spending 4, but you can get a 4 mana thing and put it on the table. But it ended up having the same problem. Like the things you could search up just aren't strong enough. And the setup with bargain, like there's way better things you should be spending your bargain fodder on than Beseech the Mirror. It just wasn't worth doing, and it has a win rate of 47.1%, for a reason. I will say there are exceptions to this rule, and we know that because we've seen some tutors that do fare decently in limited. And another thing, just like I talked about with all these other effects, if this is attached to a creature, that's a whole other thing. Because then you're getting a 2-for-1, right? You're playing a creature, it searches for something. That's pretty good. But we do sort of know what the threshold is to make a tutor actually good. And that threshold is basically Demonic Tutor. It was also in the Strixhaven Mystical Archive, just like Dark Ritual was. And it had a 59.0% win rate. That's probably lower than you would think, right? This is one of the most powerful cards in the entire game. It's easily the best tutor in the entire game, I think we could say. 1 generic and a black. Search your library for anything, right? So it is weaker than you would think in limited. Like I think a lot of people would see this and be like, well, that's just going to be the best card in your entire deck, and things like that. But it probably isn't. It's probably just a very good card in your deck. A 59.0% win rate is good, but it's not like this is an insane bomb or anything like that. And tutors obviously do get better when you have insane bombs to grab. But basically, you need to be spending a small amount of mana, 2 or less generally speaking, and you need to be able to search up a wide variety of things. If the tutor is more restrictive or it costs more than that by any small amount, like a 3 mana demonic tutor is way, way worse in limited than a 2 mana one is. And a 2 mana card that can only search up certain card types is way worse than demonic tutor is in limited too. And it should be obvious that that's the case, but when I say way worse, I mean it goes from being a card that is good in your deck to being unplayable. Like that's what I mean when I say way worse. It makes that big of a difference if it costs a little bit more mana or if it's more restrictive. So those are 5 effects that are bad in limited, but good in constructed. Tutors, rituals, burn, pure burn that is, fogs, and lobotomy effects. That will do it for this week's Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron or a channel member. You can find ways to do those things in the description.